At Starbound, we tell stories the human way, not with artificial voices or AI slop. In the end, what's HFY without humanity? Subscribe to keep it this way. My name's Chikondi. Let's begin. It is a universal truth of engineering that every complex system has a single, embarrassingly simple point of failure. And Harvey Holt just never expected that reality to be delivered via a catastrophic failure of a gravitic inertial dampener, turning his survey lander, the Sandpiper, from a marvel of Terran engineering into a 50-ton lawn dart aimed squarely at the rust-colored soil of an uncharted planet. He woke to the shriek of a proximity alarm that arrived tragically late to the party. The air tasted of superheated circuits and scorched insulation. A thick ochre dust, fine as powdered rust, coated every surface, including the inside of his mouth. He coughed, a dry, racking sound that sent a spike of fire through his ribs. He catalogued his injuries with an engineer's detachment. Ribs bruised, maybe cracked. A deep gash on his forehead wept blood into his left eyebrow. Nothing life-threatening, provided he didn't take a full breath or make any sudden moves. The lander, however, was a total loss. The cockpit was a spiderweb of shattered composites and dangling conduits that threw weak sparks against the twisted bulkhead. The primary power conduit sheared clean through, leaving the ship's systems as dead as the silence now pressing in on him. He was upright, still strapped into his crash couch, which had held together through the impact. The rest of the Sandpiper had not. "Computer! Status report!" He rasped the words, a useless habit. The only reply was a faint, final sizzle as a capacitor gave up the ghost. "Right," Harvey muttered to himself, unbuckling the restraints. "Manual diagnostics it is." He spent the next hour in a painful ballet of damage control. He was Chief Systems Engineer Harvey Holt. Systems were his language, his religion, and this system was blasphemy. He crawled through the mangled corridor to the engineering bay, his every movement a negotiation with his protesting ribs. In his mind, he was already replaying the schematics, the telemetry logs from the final moments. It was a minor component, a flux regulator in the dampener's power cycling unit, a 50-credit part that failed under standard operational stress, a statistical improbability, a cosmic joke. The failure of that one component stranded him here. On the frontier colony where he grew up, every action created a debt or credit. This was an entry on a ledger he couldn't balance, a thought that hummed beneath the throb of his headache. Daylight, thin and orange through the dusty atmosphere of Karis, bled through the jagged tear in the hull. Harvey salvaged what he could. The haul fit into a single cargo net, the emergency water reclaimer, a medical kit, 3 days' worth of brick-red nutritional bars, and the ship's distress beacon. The beacon's power cell was cracked and leaking electrolyte. Useless. He sat on a piece of scorched deck plating, watching the 2 small suns of this system begin their slow climb. He broke off a piece of a nutritional bar. It tasted of synthetic cinnamon and mineral supplements, the flavor of carefully planned survival. He washed it down with a mouthful of recycled water with the lingering taste of his own sweat. He was alone. The Odyssey, his parent ship, was in a high, eccentric orbit, charting gravitational anomalies 5 light minutes away. They wouldn't even register the Sandpiper as missing for another 48 hours, per the mission charter for independent survey runs. By then, his water would be gone, and this planet's thin, arid air would have desiccated him. His gaze fell on the beacon. Its casing was intact, but the power cell was a lost cause. He needed a new one, a standard Type 3 fusion cell, a common enough piece of hardware on any civilized world. Here, it might as well be a mythical artifact. But there was a chance. During his descent, the controlled professional part, before it became an uncontrolled screaming plummet, he registered a settlement. A city, according to the preliminary scans. Low-tech, pre-hyperlane, but organized. Organization implied trade. Trade implied power sources. It was a fragile chain of assumptions, but it was all he had. He spent the rest of the day stripping the lost usable components from the lander. He found a basic translator unit, its power pack still holding a partial charge and a thermal cloak for the bone-chilling nights. He jury-rigged a crude solar charger for the translator, laying out the photovoltaic cells from a shattered panel. As the first sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long skeletal shadows across the dunes, he shouldered his pack. He gave the wreck of the Sandpiper one last look, a silent farewell to a good ship failed by a cheap part. Then he walked toward the distant smudge on the horizon that he hoped was a city, the hum of the unbalanced ledger a constant companion in the back of his mind. The trail was less a path and more a suggestion, a line in the dust where the grit was packed a little tighter, winding through rust-colored dunes. Javi followed it for what felt like an eternity, the twin suns beating down on him. The thermal cloak, reversed to its reflective side, did little to ward off the oppressive heat. The translator around his neck flickered, its diagnostic light an unsteady amber. Every breath was a sip of hot, gritty air. He crested the final dune, his legs burning and his lungs raw, and saw it. Klar. The sight of it was a cool drink in his parched soul, a current that pulled him over the final dune. The city seemed to have grown from the landscape. Its buildings were low, rounded structures of sandstone and scavenged metal, the color of the earth they stood on. They huddled together as if for warmth, their roofs and walls sculpted by the relentless wind. A thin haze of smoke and dust hung over it all. It was life in a place that seemed determined to forbid it. That feeling, he was learning, was a fleeting commodity on Karis. The bazaar was a storm of smells and sounds. The air was thick with alien spices, roasted meat from creatures he couldn't name, and the ever-present dust. The sounds were a cacophony of chittering, clicking languages, the clang of metal on metal, and the low hum of a society in motion. He was an anomaly, a ghost at the feast. His gray ship suit, torn and stained, stood out against the deep reds and ochres of the natives' simple robes. The beings here were the Glim. They were tall and slender, with leathery, earth-toned skin that ranged from pale clay to rich terracotta. Their hands were remarkable. Where a human's wrist would be, a cluster of fine, prehensile tendrils sprouted, each moving with its own purpose, independent of their long, thin fingers. These tendrils were in constant motion, weaving patterns in the air as they spoke, conveying a sublayer of communication he couldn't begin to parse. Their faces were narrow, with large, dark eyes. They blinked with a thin, nictitating membrane that swept sideways every few seconds. Javi was weakened by hunger, thirst, and the dull, persistent throb in his ribs. He had nothing to trade, no currency, no goods, nothing but the useless wreckage of his ship miles behind him. He tried to communicate with a merchant selling what looked like power cells, using gestures for his beacon and pointing at the merchant's wares. The Glim stared at him with his deep, unreadable eyes, his social tendrils curling in what felt like a gesture of dismissal, and turned away. He was invisible. He was irrelevant. He checked his water reclaimer. The reserve indicator was a single blinking red line, less than an hour's supply. The surge that had carried him here evaporated, leaving a cold, hard pit in his stomach. Surrounded by life, by a society in motion, the silence in his own head was deafening. His legs gave out, and he slid down the rough-hewn wall of a stall, the world tilting at the edges. He didn't know how long he sat there, head in his hands, the sounds of the bazaar washing over him like a distant surf. He was a system on the verge of total collapse. His own internal ledger screamed red alerts. Water reserves critical, energy levels minimal, lost entry, will to live null. A shadow fell over him. He looked up, expecting to be told to move, to be shooed away like a stray animal. Standing before him was an ancient Glim. He was frail, his ochre skin wrinkled and drawn tight over his bones. Every movement was slow and deliberate, with no wasted energy, a lifetime of conserving every calorie made physical. His robes were frayed, the color faded by a century of suns. He was a beggar, Javi realized, a cast-off, the lowest rung of any society. The old Glim looked at Javi, his dark eyes holding a stillness, like a dry well that remembered water. He saw the torn suit, The grime, the faint tremor in Harvey's hands from depleted reserves. He saw a being at the end of their rope. Without a word, the old Glim reached into a small pouch at his belt. His movements were slow, reverent. He drew out a single coin. It was a small, battered disc of a common cupro-nickel alloy, worn smooth by the passage of countless hands. He held it for a moment, then leaned down. With a slow, reverent motion, he took Harvey's hand and pressed the coin into his palm, closing his fingers around it. Harvey's translator, hanging from his neck, flickered to life. A quiet, raspy voice, synthesized from the Glim's soft clicks, whispered in his ear.
"For water,"
the voice said.
"It is all I have."
Harvey stared at the coin, then at the old Glim. He tried to push it back, to refuse. He couldn't take this being's lost possession.
"No!"
he croaked, his own voice raw.
"I can't!"
The beggar was insistent. He pushed Harvey's hand away, his small social tendrils making a soft, open gesture of offering. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, then turned and shuffled away, his back stooped, his place in the dust now empty. He vanished into the crowd, leaving Harvey holding the coin. The weight of it in his hand was immense. It was more than metal. It was a promise. It was an investment. It was an uncalculated gift from someone who had nothing, given to a stranger who had lost everything. The raw humanity of the gesture struck Harvey with the force of a physical blow. The hum of his internal, unbalanced ledger fell silent, replaced by a new, singular, deafening entry. A debt. The coin changed everything. Clutching it, the coin was a key, turning a lock in his mind. He staggered back to the stall selling power cells. The merchant, a stout Glim with terracotta skin, looked at him with renewed interest now that he held a form of currency. Harvey held out the coin.
"Power,"
he said, his voice raspy, pointing at a charged cell.
"For my beacon."
The merchant looked at the single, battered coin in Harvey's hand. The merchant's gaze shifted, recognizing not the coin, but the beggar's empty place in the dust. He understood the transaction that had just occurred. His eyes met those of another Glim across the way, who gave a slow, barely perceptible dip of his head. This was not a commercial transaction. It was a community one. The merchant's social tendrils softened from a tight coil of business to an open-handed gesture. He picked up a fully charged Type 3 power cell and placed it in Harvey's free hand. Then, with a light touch, he pushed Harvey's other hand, the one holding the coin, closed. He shook his head, refusing payment. The debt remained Halt's. Harvey could only give a shaky nod. He stumbled away from the stall into a quiet alley. With trembling fingers, he slotted the fresh power cell into his distress beacon. The device chirped to life, its indicator light blinking a steady green. He held down the activation switch. A high-frequency signal, coded with his identity and a compressed log of the Sandpiper's final moments, lanced up into the orange sky. Now he just had to wait. Hours later, as the larger sun set and the temperature began to plummet, he heard it. A faint descending whine that grew into the familiar roar of Terran atmospheric thrusters. A searchlight cut through the deepening dusk, sweeping across the rooftops of Klar before locking onto the beacon signal. The shuttle from the Odyssey descended, its landing struts kicking up a storm of ochre dust. The ramp lowered, and two figures in ship suits ran towards him. As they helped him to his feet, guiding him into the clean, sterile light of the shuttle, he kept his fist clenched. Inside it, pressing into his palm, was a single worn coin. The ledger was open. A debt had been incurred. And Harvey Holt always paid what he owed. The debriefing room aboard the Odyssey was the antithesis of Karis. It was sterile, quiet, and climate-controlled. The air hummed with the faint thrum of the life support scrubbers, a clean scent that held no memory of wind or dust. Harvey, now showered, fed, and stitched up, stood at parade rest in a fresh gray uniform. The only remnant of his ordeal was the dark hollows under his eyes and the grease still settled deep in the lines of his hands. Across the polished alloy table sat Captain Mei Lin. She was in her early 50s, her hair streaked with silver, pulled back into a severe regulation bun. Her posture was so rigid it seemed to defy the ship's artificial gravity. She looked at Javi with the cool, appraising gaze of a commander on a fast track to the Admiralty assessing a damaged asset. "Your preliminary report is concise, engineer." She tapped a finger on the datapad in front of her. "Failure of a flux regulator in the port inertial dampener. You attribute this to a substandard component?"
Yes, Captain. The telemetry confirms it. A 50-credit part that cost us a 12 million credit lander and nearly cost me my life.
His jaw was tight, the muscles corded, but his voice was flat, professional. "I will note it in my full report to the Terran Authority Engineering Corps," Lin said. "They will, I'm sure, be thrilled." There was no sarcasm in her voice, only a statement of fact. She made a note. "Now, regarding your survival, you were assisted by the indigenous population, the Glim."
One of them, yes,
Javi said. He reached into his pocket and placed the battered coin on the mirror-bright surface of the table. It looked small and insignificant in the stark room.
He was a beggar. He had nothing, and he gave me this.
Lin looked at the coin, her expression unchanging. Her hands remained flat on the table.
He gave me everything he had, Captain,
Javi continued, leaning forward just enough to break parade rest.
He saved my life. The merchant who gave me the power cell only did so because he saw the beggar's gift. We have a debt.
An emotional debt, which I'm sure you feel deeply,
Lin said, her eyes lifting to meet his.
The log will reflect the assistance rendered.
No, Captain. Not an emotional debt. A debt. An actual, quantifiable entry on the ledger. It's unbalanced. We have to go back.
Lin's expression hardened by a fraction of a degree.
Go back? For what purpose, engineer?
To repay him. To settle the account.
Javi could feel the steady thrum of the ship's engines through the soles of his boots. It was the pulse of a mission, a schedule, a 5-year plan for charting gravitational anomalies that had no room for unscheduled detours motivated by sentiment.
Engineer Halt,
Lin said, her voice dropping a register, becoming even quieter, which Harvey knew was far more dangerous than if she'd shouted.
Let me be clear. The Odyssey is a survey ship on a long-range mission with strict fuel and time allotments. We do not have the resources to divert from our primary objective for what you are describing as a sentimental gesture. You survived. The debt, as you call it, is paid. You are dismissed.
The words were final, a steel door slamming shut. Javi stood his ground for a moment longer, his jaw tight. He wanted to argue, to explain that where he grew up, a promise was currency, and an unpaid debt was a stain on your entire family. But he knew it was useless. Lin operated on regulations and risk assessments, not on the simple rule that you always pay what you owe. He gave a curt nod.
Yes, Captain.
He turned and walked out of the room, leaving the small, battered coin sitting alone on the captain's mirror-finished desk. The refusal was a solid wall Javi couldn't seem to breach. He spent the next ship day running diagnostics on the shuttle, losing himself in the familiar work, but the problem gnawed at him. He saw Lin in the corridor and tried to approach her again, but she cut him off with a look that could freeze hydrogen. The ledger remained open, its single entry mocking him. He was in the mess hall, pushing a scoop of reconstituted soy protein around his tray, when a whirlwind of flailing limbs and frantic energy descended upon his table.
Halt! Javi, my man!
Dr. Renfield Ren Olek slid onto the bench opposite him, dropping a datapad with a clatter. Olek was the chief science officer, a man whose lanky frame seemed to be held together by caffeine and an obsessive need to poke things to see what they'd do. His lab coat was a map of faint chemical stains, and his hair looked like he'd been running experiments on static electricity using his own head.
Doctor,
Javi said, his eyes fixed on his tray.
I overheard your debrief.
Oleg said, leaning so far forward his voice dropped to a whisper.
Fascinating stuff. The moral quandary, the cultural imperative. Very dramatic. But that's not what I'm here about.
Figured.
The planet! Halt! Karis! I've been reviewing the Sandpiper's preliminary survey data. My god, man, do you know what that dust ball is made of?
Javi's head snapped up, intrigued despite himself. Dust?
Carbon!
Oleg exclaimed, his hands flying up to emphasize the point.
The crust is 42% raw unbonded carbon, with significant graphitic and amorphous deposits. It's a veritable celestial charcoal briquette! The geological pressure is immense, but the heat is too low for significant crystallization. It's a planet waiting for a push!
Javi stared at him.
That's not how geology works, Ren. Not on its own!
A manic light sparked in Oleg's eyes.
You want to repay a debt. You want to give this beggar something of value. But what's valuable to a pre-hyperlane species on a resource-poor world? Gold? Platinum? Useless. But what if you could give them something that would make their entire planet the most valuable piece of real estate in the sector? What if you could repay a single coin with a mountain of, well, a different kind of coin?
A slow, dangerous idea formed in Javi's mind. It was insane. It was illogical. It violated a dozen Concord regulations about cultural contamination and planetary interference.
What are you talking about, Ren?
Javi asked. Oleg grinned, a wide, triumphant slash across his face. He spun his datapad around. On the screen was a schematic of the Odyssey with two systems highlighted in pulsing red, the atmospheric carbon processor and the deep crustal sonar array.
I'm talking about a little creative engineering, Oleg said. I'm talking about giving that planet a squeeze.
Oleg's quarters resembled a disaster zone of half-finished projects and fossilized coffee cups. Yet he navigated the mess without dislodging a single precarious stack, pulling up geological charts and power flow diagrams on a wall-sized monitor.
Okay, look,
he said, pointing a trembling finger at a cross-section of Karis's crust.
The principle is simple. Diamonds are just carbon atoms squeezed together under immense heat and pressure. Karis has the carbon and the pressure in spades. It just lacks the heat. The planet's core is sluggish, geologically speaking.
So we give it the heat? Javi asked, leaning in. He felt the familiar pull of a complex engineering problem, a welcome distraction from his moral one.
Not heat, energy, a catalyst,
Oleg corrected, practically bouncing on the balls of his feet.
We can't just nuke the place. That would be unsubtle and messy. But we have two perfectly good high-energy systems we use for surveying every day.
He brought up the schematics for the ship's systems.
First, the atmospheric carbon processor. We use it to collect atmospheric samples. It ionizes and separates molecules. If we overclock it, invert the ionization field, and focus the beam, we can use it to pull carbon out of the upper atmosphere and inject concentrated streams of it deep into tectonically unstable regions.
You want to use it as a giant carbon fire hose, Javi said, a slow smile spreading across his face.
Precisely! We supersaturate the target zones. Then,
he swiped the screen, bringing up the sonar array schematics.
We use the deep crustal sonar array. Normally, we use it to ping the mantle and map geological formations. It sends out focused sound waves, right? But if we bypass the safety limiters and channel a full power conduit load into the emitters,
you'd trigger a shockwave deep in the crust, Javi finished, his engineer's mind racing ahead. A focused sonic blast, a shockwave, a massive instantaneous pressure spike.
A planetary scale hammer strike, Oleg crowed. We target the major fault lines, the places where the pressure is already at a breaking point. We inject the carbon, then we hit it with the sonar blast. The sudden focus pressure will trigger an allotropic phase transition. The amorphous carbon will crystallize. Boom! Deep vein gem blooms. Massive concentrated veins of industrial-grade diamonds, miles deep, all along the planet's fault lines.
Javi stared at the proposal. It was audacious. It was reckless. It pushed the ship's systems so far beyond their design specifications that it was a miracle the simulation didn't just burst into virtual flames.
The risks,
Harvey asked, his voice sober. Oleg's excitement deflated slightly. He ran a hand through his already chaotic hair.
Ah, yes, them. Well, for starters, overclocking the processor and the sonar simultaneously will put an unprecedented strain on the power conduits. If we get a feedback loop, we could fry half the ship's systems. Best case, we're dead in the water. Worst case, the reactor containment fails.
And the emitters?
The sonar emitters aren't designed for that kind of energy output. They'll crack, almost certainly. We'll be lucky if they're usable for low-power scans afterwards. Our primary mission of charting gravitational anomalies? Crippled.
Harvey was silent for a long moment, the hum of the ship filling the space between them. The plan was certifiably insane. It was a career-ending, court-martial-worthy act of cosmic vandalism. And it was the most beautiful, elegant, and absurdly appropriate solution he had ever seen. It was overkill on a scale that balanced the ledger perfectly. "Let's go talk to the captain," Harvey said. Presenting the plan to Captain Lin was like trying to explain fireworks to a rock. They stood before her desk again, this time with Oleg at Harvey's side, gesticulating wildly at the projections he'd displayed on her wall monitor. Harvey went first, framing it as a matter of principle.
"Captain, this isn't about feelings. It's about how we're seen. Humanity is new to this stage. Our currency is our word. What does it say about us if we accept a life-saving gift from the poorest member of a society and leave it unpaid? It says we are takers. It says we can be cheated."
Lynn listened, her face impassive. She didn't look at Harvey. She looked at the plan on the wall. Then Oleg launched into his part, toning down the manic energy and adopting the smooth, confident cadence of a scientist presenting a paper.
"From a purely scientific perspective, Captain, this is a unique opportunity. A minimal-risk, high-impact atmospheric and geological test, as I'm prepared to log it. We would be the first to document induced large-scale allotropic phase transition on a planetary scale. The data would be invaluable."
He paused, letting that sink in before delivering the final calculated blow.
"And consider the soft power implications. The story will get out. A human vessel repaying a beggar's gift not with trinkets, but with a geological transformation that enriches an entire world. The strategic value of such a legend is considerable."
Lynn was silent for a full minute after they finished. The only sound was the faint whisper of the air circulation. She looked from the frantic energy of Oleg to the rigid, determined set of Harvey's jaw.
"The risks to this vessel are not minimal, Doctor,"
she said, her voice dangerously soft.
"You are proposing we deliberately cripple a primary system and risk a catastrophic power failure, jeopardizing the lives of all 112 souls aboard this ship."
She turned her gaze to Harvey.
"All to settle a personal score."
"It's not personal, Captain," Harvey said. "It's human."
"Your definitions are irrelevant,"
Lynn stated, standing up. It was a clear dismissal.
"I have heard your proposal. I will take it under advisement. Now get off my bridge."
They left, the silence in the corridor outside feeling heavier than any shouting match. The wall they had run into felt even more solid than before. Harvey's shoulders slumped. He had failed. The ledger would remain unbalanced. Alone in her ready room, Captain Mei Lin stared at the single worn coin still sitting on her desk. Halt's words echoed in her ears.
"It's not personal. It's human."
It was a ridiculous, sentimental, illogical statement. It was also, she suspected, profoundly true. Duty and regulations were the stars she'd navigated by. They were fixed, reliable points in the chaos of space. But humanity was not a fixed point. It was a variable. A messy, unpredictable emotional variable that constantly threatened to throw her careful calculations into disarray. She saw the pattern in it. Adherence to a personal code, when scaled, produced strategic outcomes regulations could never predict. On a hunch, she pulled up Harvey Halt's service record. It was exemplary. A brilliant engineer, a problem solver. But there was one anomaly. a formal reprimand for disobeying a direct order filed 3 years ago. Attached to it was a sealed commendation from the highest levels of the Terran Authority Strategic Command. Her captain's clearance gave her access. She opened the file. The incident was classified. Holt, then a junior engineer on the TAS Griffin, was part of a team evacuating a remote frontier colony, Series 4, before a predicted solar flare. The evacuation was behind schedule. His commanding officer ordered him to abandon a group of colonists who were late to the rendezvous in order to save the ship. Holt refused. He held the shuttle, took a hit from the flare's edge, and brought everyone back, violating a direct order and damaging Authority property. The colonists he'd saved, it turned out, were the sole keepers of a unique agricultural yeast strain vital to the outer colonies. His act of honoring a simple promise, "We don't leave anyone behind," resulted in a massive, unforeseen strategic victory for the Terran Authority, shoring up the entire sector's food supply for a decade. The reprimand was for the official record. The commendation was for the result. Lynn leaned back in her chair, looking from the file to the coin. This human bug, this stubborn insistence on honoring debts and promises regardless of scale, wasn't a flaw. It was a feature. A wildly unpredictable and dangerous one, but a feature nonetheless, and it had paid dividends before. She looked at Oleg's proposal again. It was insane. It was also brilliant. She found the loophole she was looking for in a subsection of the mission charter regarding equipment calibration. She could log the entire maneuver as a high-yield, deep-crustal stress test to calibrate sonar array sensitivity in a high-carbon environment. It was just plausible enough to pass a cursory review. The paperwork would be a nightmare, but it was doable. She keyed the ship-wide comm.
Halt! Oleg! Report to the bridge!
When they arrived, their expressions were wary, expecting the final nail in the coffin. Lynn didn't look at them. She looked out at the starfield through her main view screen.
Mr. Oleg, prepare to bring the atmospheric processor and the sonar array online. Link them through the primary power conduit as per your test proposal. Mr. Holt, you will be at engineering monitoring the conduits. If they fluctuate more than 5% outside projected tolerance, you pull the plug. Understood?
Harvey and Oleg could only exchange a look of blank incomprehension. "Captain?" Harvey managed. Lynn finally turned to face them, her expression as stern as ever.
I am authorizing your calibration test, but if this messes up my mission report, Holt, I'm billing you for the ink.
The Odyssey hung in high orbit over Karis, a sliver of silver against the black. The ship was silent, but it was the silence of a held breath. On the bridge, the main view screen showed a topographical map of the planet, overlaid with a spiderweb of fault lines. "Targeting first fault line, the Great Kalar Rift," Oleg announced from the science station, his usual manic energy focused into a laser of concentration. "Processor is charged. Emitters are hot. On your mark, Captain." Lynn nodded.
Proceed.
"Injecting carbon stream." On the screen, a thin blue line descended from their orbital position, striking a designated point on the map. Deep in the bowels of the ship, Harvey stood before an engineering console, his stare fixed on the power flow schematic. The low thrum that vibrated through the deck plates deepened into a resonant hum. "Conduits at 90% of maximum load," Harvey reported, his voice steady over the comm. "Containment fields are stable. She's holding." "Injection complete," Oleg said, his right hand keyed in a bypass command while his left slapped a coolant release valve. "Rerouting power to the sonar array. Halt, this is the big one." "I see it," Harvey said. The power schematic on his screen flashed red as the energy load spiked. 110%. 120. The system is screaming at me, Ren. "Let it scream," Oleg muttered. "Firing sonar pulse in 3, 2, 1, mark!" A wave of pure force, a sonic hammer blow aimed at the heart of the world, lanced down from the Odyssey. The ship bucked. Alarms shrieked. "Massive energy feedback!" Harvey yelled over the din.
Emitter 1's primary coolant line just flashed to steam! It's cracked! I'm venting plasma, but the emitter is a loss!
Hold it together, Halt!
Lin's voice was iron.
Pulse was delivered! Oleg reported, his voice tight. The data! My God! The seismic readings are off the charts! We can still do this, but we'll be running the remaining too hot! Captain! Javi cut in, his voice strained. The conduits can't take 16 more hits like that!
Then find a way, engineer!
Lin ordered. Javi scanned his console, his mind racing.
One way! I can create a temporary buffer using the port cargo bay's inertial dampeners. It'll slag them, but it should hold the conduits together. We get one shot at this.
Do it,
Lin said without hesitation. They repeated the process 16 more times, striking targeted points along the planet's major fault lines. Each time, the ship groaned under the strain. Each time, Javi wrestled with the titanic forces flowing through the ship's veins, rerouting power surges, his hands a blur across the console, shunting gigawatts of raw energy into the buffer fractions of a second before they could overload the system. By the time they finished, 2 of the 3 sonar emitters were cracked, the port cargo dampeners were fused slag, and the entire crew could feel the exhaustion deep in their bones. The Odyssey, wounded but alive, pulled away from Karis, leaving the dusty planet to its fate. Down below, deep in the planet's crust, trillions of tons of carbon underwent a slow, violent transformation. The debt was paid. The ledger, Javi hoped, was finally balanced. 6 months later, the crew of the Odyssey was gathered in the mess hall, watching a chaotic galactic news report. The story wasn't about gravitational anomalies or territorial disputes. It was about Karis.
The forgotten backwater world of Karis has become the epicenter of a galactic gem rush of unprecedented scale,
The Serpentine's Zophian reporter chirped, her twin cranial tails twitching. The screen showed a chaotic orbital view of the planet, swarmed by hundreds of prospector ships, from grimy independent haulers to sleek corporate cruisers.
Reports from the surface speak of a divine event, what the native Glim are calling the Tears of the Stars,
The reporter continued.
Recent planet-wide seismic tremors have begun to unearth massive, deep veins of raw, industrial-grade diamonds. Geologists are baffled, calling it a one-in-a-billion-year geological event.
The camera cut to ground footage. Kalar was unrecognizable. The dusty streets were crowded with off-worlders of a dozen species, haggling, shouting, and setting up makeshift mining equipment. There were images of Glim, their dark eyes wide, holding raw diamonds the size of their fists as if they were strange glittering rocks.
But the sudden influx of staggering wealth has thrown the traditional, non-materialistic Glim society into chaos,
The reporter concluded.
A new philosophical movement is rising around a mysterious figure known as the Saint of the Coin, who preaches that the only way to fight the outsider's hunger is to give everything away, creating a unique economic and cultural crisis.
The report ended. A stunned silence filled the mess hall. Dr. Olek leaned closer to the screen, a grin spreading across his face.
Incredible! The socioeconomic impact is even more dramatic than I predicted.
Javi stared at the screen, the blood draining from his face. Beside him, Captain Lin's face was a mask of deep critical assessment, her eyes calculating the geopolitical fallout.
We didn't pay a debt,
Javi whispered, the realization dawning on him.
We broke a world.
We are going back,
Lin announced, her voice leaving no room for argument. The official reason, logged in the ship's records, was a follow-up survey to assess long-term seismic echoes from the calibration test. The real reason was to see what they had done. The orbital traffic jam was even worse than the news report had shown. A makeshift blockade of corporate security frigates had been established. Lin didn't bother negotiating. She broadcast her Terran Authority credentials on all channels, bluffed her way through by claiming a Priority 1 Concord investigation into illegal planetary exploitation, and sailed the Odyssey through the blockade as if she owned the sky. The corporate ships, unwilling to challenge a military-grade vessel from a species known for its disproportionate responses, broke formation to let her pass. On the ground, Kalar was a city choking on its own good fortune. The air, once merely dusty, now hung thick with a glittering haze of fine, abrasive diamond powder from countless mining operations. Brightly lit signs in a dozen alien languages advertised claim assessors, buyers, and lenders. The low, sandstone buildings were dwarfed by prefabricated hab units and gaudy cantinas erected by the off-worlders. The change wasn't all bad. They saw Glim children who should have been learning how to find water or preserve food, instead sitting in a circle, laughing as they used piles of raw diamonds as building blocks. They saw a new hydro-purification plant, built with off-world money, providing clean water to the entire city. But they also saw the ugly side. They witnessed a hulking, beetle-browed Goro merchant bullying a Glim elder, trying to trade a crate of cheap glowing trinkets for a sack of diamonds worth 1,000 times more. In the distance, a massive strip mining operation, run by a faceless corporation, was carving a gargantuan scar into the planet's surface, the dust cloud from its operations visible for miles. They hadn't just brought wealth, they had brought predators. They had brought rot. They had brought the galaxy, with all its hunger, to a world that had never known it. They found him in the same dusty square where Javi had first collapsed. Heska. He was not in a palace surrounded by riches. He was sitting on a simple woven mat in the shade of a newly erected community shelter. He was at the center of a quiet storm of activity. His frayed robes had been replaced by clean, well-made ones, but his demeanor was unchanged. He was distributing food, medicine, and water purifiers, all purchased with the diamonds that people brought to him, to the members of his community. He was teaching them, in his quiet, raspy voice, to counter the off-worlders' sickness of hoarding by practicing the Glim strength of giving. He was the saint of the coin. He looked up as Javi, Lin, and Oleg approached. His ancient dark eyes swept over them, settling on Javi with a quiet acknowledgement. He gave a slow, deliberate nod, the same nod he had given when he'd pressed the coin into Javi's hand. Javi approached him alone. Heska was now using a new, high-quality translator, a gift from a follower. Its synthesized voice was clear and smooth. "I'm sorry," Javi began, the words feeling small and useless. I wanted to repay you. I didn't mean for all of this. The fighting, the hunger." Heska looked out at the transformed city, at the distant cloud of the strip mine. The lines around his eyes seemed deeper, etched by a profound weariness, but his gaze was clear. "A storm has no meaning," he said through the translator. "It simply is. It clears away the old dust and reveals what is underneath. The storm you brought is loud, and many are lost in the noise. But you did not bring the storm to cause harm." "I brought it to pay a debt," Javi said. "You saw a being in need, and you gave," Heska corrected, his voice soft. "The scale is different, but the heart is the same. That is the only part that has value." He reached into the pouch at his belt, the one that had once been empty save for a single coin. His hand emerged, and Javi expected to see a flawless diamond, a symbol of his new status. But in Heska's palm lay the original coin, battered, worn, its clan marking worn to a faint ghost. "The off-welders bring me stones," Heska said, his gaze fixed on the small disk of metal. "They say that they have value. They fight for them. They cheat for them. They are just stones." He closed his hand around the coin. "This has value. This was a debt. This was everything. The rest is just dust." Javi stood there, the weight of those words settling over him. He had come here trying to balance a ledger, to turn a principle into a tangible payment. He had operated like an engineer, believing every problem had a solution, every debt a price. But Heska, the beggar who had nothing, understood value in a way Harvey never had. Some things couldn't be repaid. They could only be honored. Back on the bridge of the Odyssey, the ship charting a course away from the chaotic jewel box that was now Karis, Captain Lin recorded a final log entry.
Log supplemental. Our follow-up survey of Karis is complete. The planet is undergoing an unexpected and rapid economic and social transformation due to the discovery of extensive crystalline carbon deposits. The nature of our calibration test will be redacted from all public logs pursuant to Concord Pre-Contact Directive 7A. It is my official assessment, however, that Terran-Glim relations are now robust.
She ended the recording and looked over at Harvey, who was staring out the main view screen at the receding planet. He knew the truth. They all did. Humanity hadn't just made a new friend. They had forged a new reputation, a legend that was already spreading through the hyperlane trade routes and cantinas. They were the species that repaid a beggar's lost coin with planetary upheaval. They were the ones for whom no gesture was too small to be met with a response on a terrifying, absurd, and world-shattering scale. Harvey thought of the 50-credit flux regulator that had started it all. The phantom weight of that 50-credit failure. The weight of one small failure traded for an immense shared burden. It wasn't the neat, balanced ledger he had always sought. It was messy. It was complicated. And as he watched Karis shrink to a glittering point of light, a new understanding of what it meant to be human settled into his bones. It meant being a species that, when given a single coin representing everything, would answer by giving a world, and then coming back to apologize for the noise.